Hello, everybody, and welcome to PGS Moving Image. I am your host, Arden, and we are back. Welcome back to part two for our Blade Runner discussion. Fortunately, we do have Catherin here with us again today. Catherin, how are you today?
Very good. Thank you.
Excellent. And Kamran is here as well. Kamran, how are you?
I'm here. I'm excited to talk about this movie. I had not seen this movie before, so it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Okay, wonderful. When we last met, Cameron, we did talk about elements of the first film, which I'm calling 82. And we actually talked a lot about the first film and a few elements of the second film, which I'm calling 49 because it's 2049. And now that you've had a chance to see 49, we're going to go into that in more detail, of course. And this one of the first things that's so interesting about 2049 is how the runtime of this film. You certainly are. I almost feel like they had to make this very special. It's Villeneuve who directed, of course, and they wanted to give you your money's worth. And the film picks up, is it 30 years where the last story left off? And incidentally, although Tyrell is no longer in charge, another company has taken its place. Wallace, kind of that still a person who happened to be an opportunist. He saved the earth by creating this way of making food for, on an earth that is, devastated by the war. So he ends up buying out Tyrell. And even though Tyrell has this trouble, there's an uprising in 2020 of the replicants. Now it seems like Wallace has created new replicants who are even more subservient than the last ones. I mean, it's a lot. There's a lot that's happened, but it's a great story. I mean, I think that what they did here is amazing. And we are actually still at a situation where replicants are still being retired, the older ones, but there's a remarkable discovery in this film, and we're going to talk about it there. So, Catherin, what was your overall impression of just the cinematography of Blade Runner 2049?
Gorgeous cinematography, some of the best I've seen yet. And I love that for a modern movie, it's very patient with it. It's not frenetically cutting to every different, every 2 seconds to some other shot. Like for instance, in the scene when Kay is going through the landfill, that's like a solid 15 or 20 minutes where he's just basically walking around through it, and you just get a bask in all this. It's like, yeah, it's garbage, but the way it's framed looks really beautiful, and you're just totally getting to actually, let's chill out. Let's actually take this in. Same when he goes into Las Vegas. And so the cinematography is absolutely gorgeous. And yes, that's kind of pushes the runtime to over 2.5 hours, but I didn't mind it because I think it fits the tone of the movie perfectly. Well-deserved Oscar for Roger Deakins, finally, But yeah, it very gorgeous and just very mesmerizing to watch.
And Cameron, the same question. What is your overall impression of the cinematography in Blade Runner 2049?
Well, the cinematography, as Catherine just said, is just magnificent, and it needed to be what it was. I mean, I had no problem with the length of the film. I was happy to have long periods of just looking at this world because that's what Blade Runner is known for, is that even back 40 years ago, it gave us an insight into a new world that visually was decades ahead of what we thought was possible even then. And you wanted to learn more about this world, and you actually only saw a limited part of this world. Now you see other planets because they're referenced in the first movie, that they're created these replicants to go to other planets. You see other planets. There is something that happened outside of the world we know it. We now understand that there was a nuclear war. Now it's very clear in this film, and we go into the nuclear wastelands. And the time that we see all of these different realms of this world, you needed it. Because that's my overall comment about this film, is that I think in many ways it deepens the Blade Runner mythology, and this is how it did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is very insightful, and I have very much the same sentiment about it. And this whole show is about the cinematic legacy of Blade Runner, and certainly what a fantastic presentation they've given us. And I also think what's very interesting is that some of the presentation has, kind of these nuances of other famous IPs as well, like Terminator and Alien. There's definitely like these subtle nuances in the cinematography that I can't help but see. For example, some of the initial shots we see, we can see landscapes, but they have a Terminator feel versus, that original Blade Runner feel, where it kind of felt, kind of haunting, and it was trying to mesmerize you and give you a very different type of impression of what the land is like. The Terminator feel felt a little bit more intimidating. And then it suddenly occurred to me, it's like it was intentional. They wanted you to have those emotions different from the original film because things have changed.
Yeah.
And we're going to find out what those changes are. But those landscapes were so important. I also was going to say what I thought was interesting was that while we did see those similar landmarks, the neon signs that we would be expecting, the pyramid-shaped buildings and things like that, I also got an Alien feel. There was this impression of the Alien franchise in the sense that all of a sudden it's not just Tyrell, now it's Wallace, and it felt like there was this company feeling, this conglomerate now is in place, and the stakes are even higher than they were before. Does it mean that the Tyrell Corporation is any stronger or weaker than Wallace? I'm not sure, but it felt that way. I think that they upped the stakes just by the impression in the film alone, which was something I wasn't expecting for the sequel. And it really kind of made you invested because, now at that point, you realize that the element, or at least the feeling of what we're being told about, is going to have much more gravitas to it. And I think that did you want to say something, Cameron?
No, I interrupted you. Go finish your thought, and I'll.
I think that was important to do, and just by visuals alone, we got that feeling. What were you going to say, Cameron?
Well, I'm going to say that, and I guess we'll go into spoilers of the courses so we can actually talk about this film, right?
Yes.
But I will say, without really a spoiler yet, I think that choice that you're discussing about how more advanced the world seems, and the question you're asking, is Wallace Corp more advanced than Tyrell Corp? Well, that's the interesting conundrum of this movie, which links back to our conversation with Catherin last week, right? On one level, it is more advanced. You've got more advanced replicants, more advanced technology that we're seeing. On another level, they can't solve certain things that Tyrell solved, right? That remain a mystery to them. And so it goes back to some of the conversation we had about the original movie, which I think taps into the idea, the great fear that human beings have of being, as we replace the Neanderthals, that we will be replaced, right? But then at the same time, we are even though that's our greatest fear, we're nonetheless trying to replicate our creator in trying to create life, right? And so here we've got a similar sort of pattern, that we've advanced the world beyond what the Neanderthals could, right? Well, maybe they would have if they'd been given a chance. They didn't get that chance, right? But we advanced the world beyond the world they lived in. At the same time, we can't recreate the spark that created the Neanderthals. Right. So, or at least we're trying. I don't believe we will ever be able to, but that's certainly our failed effort now, and that's our frustration. I think it taps into that.
Well, Cameron, last time we met, you'd mentioned that Blade Runner 82 was the type of film you like to make or have in your repertoire. Of course, I'm paraphrasing this. Mm-hmm. Do you share that sentiment with Blade Runner 2049?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. It was a very hard task to attempt to make a sequel or a continuation of the story of Blade Runner. There's a reason it took over 40 years to do it, or nearly 40 years to do it. And it's because that all the elements had to come together, and the elements did come together. I think the script is wonderful. I think the visuals are wonderful. I think it's the right director. We'll talk about the cast. I think this cast is magical. Right. In many ways, the original film's cast was magical, and we see some of them in interesting ways in this film as well. And so it just felt like a confluence of rare things. We say in Hollywood, getting anything made is a miracle. Anything, even a bad version of your script, getting it on the screen is a miracle, because I've been through this process, 22 years of mostly failures, of people, that's the best script I've ever read. And then you spend 20 years trying to make it, right? And then you see something like this, you're like, okay, this is, as they said in the movie, I've seen a miracle with my eyes, right? And this is a beyond, it's a whole other level, because getting any movie made is a miracle. Getting Blade Runner made was a miracle. Beyond that, an exponential level, and then actually making a worthy sequel is another exponential miracle to me. And yes, that's beyond. I would love if when 100 years from now, my Wikipedia page has something of this caliber.
Absolutely. And Catherin, in this story, we're introduced to a character whose name is K. He's a model number. It's essentially his model and serial number, who is a replicant, and certainly played very well. And I find it very interesting that initially when we realized that we're going to be following a replicant, you know, I wasn't quite sure exactly how this was going to play out and how people would respond to the replicant, let's say, being the main character, because it's one of the questions I think that a lot of people were concerned with. You know, is there more importance if the character is human versus a replicant? Does it matter? And we talked a little bit about this in our last meeting about whether it's even relevant for us to know, or even does it change the story if Deckard is a replicant or not. But what I found fascinating about this, Catherin, is that Kay is a police officer. He is a Blade Runner. And he's terminating these replicants, these older model replicants. And some of them have been around for a long time. When he finally meets up with this Sapper Morton character, this guy's been, you know, alive for decades. And now suddenly, you know, there's an interest in finding him. And Kay, you know, has gotten instructions to report to this place. He goes there. And it's interesting because he's a medical replicant, who I suspect performed a special operation. You know, there's this big reveal, but he's been holding the secret for so many years, knowing very well that Kay is there. Why doesn't Sapper just go ahead and tell him what has happened there? You know, I mean, there's something that's on Sapper's property, or the property that he's on, this farm, Catherin. Why doesn't Sapper just tell Kay about this miracle that he's witnessed? What do you think about that?
Because he can tell that he's not going to care. Kay's whole existence is pretty depressing and cynical. He's a hitman who goes out to kill other versions of replicants. And as we see, everybody in his apartment building hates him and treats him like like scum, like some subhuman creature. And they're always spraying graffiti on his wall, barking at him all the time. And he has to go in to do these loyalty tests screenings like every day. And he doesn't, and none of it seems to get to him. He's like a robot. I mean, literally like more of a robot than he is. He's not expressing any type of human emotion similar to, like, say, Roy Batty. He doesn't seem to have any self-interest other than when he's at home with his apartment with Joy. And so Sapper can see that when he shows up at the farm, because he's just, you know, he's got this dead look in his eyes. I'm just here. And the way he talks to Sapper, like he just expects him to obey. Okay, you can just sit down. I'm going to kill you now, type of thing. Which is why he tells him, you're this way simply because you've never seen a miracle. But he doesn't think he's going to be able to appreciate that either, because he's been so programmed, figuratively speaking, or literally and figuratively, into being just this cold-blooded hitman who just doesn't have like much of a soul anymore. So that's why Sapper's like not going to waste his time with it. Plus, Sapper's already done what he needed to do, and he's just been kind of there, you know, keeping the secret. And as we find out later in the movie, there's like a whole underground movement of replicants who are, you know, in agreement with Sapper, who are aware of him. So he feels like he doesn't really need to do anything anymore. And he's certainly not going to spend what could potentially be his last moments trying to impress, you know, this guy who's come to kill him. And just like we see with the Edward James Olmos character talking to him, like, yeah, answering his questions while he's folding origami sheep. It just makes the point of, this is your existence, you know?
Well, on that, Catherin, so what's interesting, and this is because I have questions. I mean, this movie is intentionally ambiguous in certain areas, and I think that was the right choice so that we can all discuss it, which is the first movie is even more ambiguous in many ways, right? And thankfully, they don't resolve some of the ambiguities of the first movie here, right? They continue the ambiguity. But if I remember, because I saw it last night, and so some of the dialogue is still fresh in my mind. If I remember, the revolutionary leader that we'll talk about at some point, who we discover is the revolutionary leader of the replicants to stage an uprising for the next movie that so far has not happened, right? But they say to our replicant, to Kay, they say to that Sapper didn't. That's why Sapper let you kill him. So there's this, and we're going to get to the issues of how is he related to this. He's obviously related to this story in some fashion that he doesn't fully understand, and they don't really explain it. But there is this mystery. Sapper seems to know, at least from that dialogue as I interpreted it, Sapper seems to know this guy is somehow connected to the overarching mystery of this movie and lets himself be killed to preserve that mystery, or maybe set that guy in motion in the direction they need him to go. All of that is a little ambiguous for me still, but I think it is in the, she certainly says it, the Sapper let you kill him for XYZ reason, which isn't clear to me.
Yeah, that is a very interesting observation, and we do have a lot to discuss with this film. This is I'm so excited. Cameron, we saw Kay touch boiling hot water in, or at least not boiling item, let's say a pot that's been on the stove that's got to be super hot, you know, incredibly dangerous. We saw something similar Pris did in the 82 film, where she sticks her hand into boiling water. And, you know, I was again reminded how remarkable these replicants are. But in an attempt to subdue them, do you think the action of making them more subservient worked, and has essentially the notion of their emotional state and awareness, what maybe they should have been focusing on, been overlooked?
Well, I'm going to now take it into territory that's uncomfortable, but the movie is primed to that. We're looking at the history of slavery in the United States, right? Okay. You know, so we look at the history of that. Certainly the original, you know, slaves that were brought here, many of them did rebel. They were thrown off the boats, right? And some of them rebelled when they arrived on the continent, right? Didn't end well for most of them, right? Because there's nowhere to go. And they would be caught and they would be horrifically tortured and killed. So those rebellions were largely put down, unlike in Haiti, where Haiti successfully, to my knowledge, the only successful slave rebellion in history, because Spartacus wasn't successful. He got killed. They all got wiped out, right? So he was sort of a martyr, right? Whereas Haiti, they ousted their slave owners, and they're still, you know, poor but free country, right? And so in the United States history, and perhaps the history of slavery throughout, you know, slavery's existed probably since we first enslaved some Neanderthal we caught in a net, right? You know, 10,000 years ago. I mean, it's been around for a while. And so this pattern repeats itself, where the person gets broken down, and the way that you enforce the system is through other members of that group, right? And that's the history of how it was enforced in the United States. Malcolm X talked very much about this. Malcolm X talked very much about the idea of the house slaves versus the field slaves. And the house slaves were given certain privileges that made them feel superior to the field slaves, and then they were invested in preserving the system because they had some place in the hierarchy. And I think, you know, we directly see that here, because, you know, the character of the replicant, the woman who is working, you know, with the corporation to achieve some of its objectives, you know, she's a ruthless killer of fellow replicants. We see that pretty horrifically here, right? And there's this moment, and I'm jumping ahead to the movie, but at the end of the movie, but there's this moment which I understood her in relationship to this dynamic we're talking about, because when she's having a fight to the death with our hero, okay, and she thinks she's overpowered him and he's gonna die, she says triumphantly, "I'm the superior model," right? Okay, that's the things. I'm the house slave. I'm the superior model. And, you know, she has her victory, right, in her mind, at least at that moment. And that's a tragedy of all of this, is that, you know, the system cannot be enforced unless people involved in it are enforcing it, right? As the Haitians showed, when they stopped enforcing and the whole system rebelled, the guys just fled the island, right? And so, you know, that's a situation. And so that's, I think, the complexity we're dealing with. And it is deeper than history of the United States Civil War. It's deeper. It goes back to the origin of us, you know, trapping prisoners of war, whatever we did, that the origins of slavery that began, that are, you know, in time immemorial in the human condition.
Interesting. And Catherin, while Kay after Kay has already, I guess, killed Sapper in the story, you know, he sees this tree. It's a dead tree. It's got chains holding it up. It's, you know, it has all this stuff so that it stays upright, or else it would topple over. And that tree is probably worth a fortune, even though it's dead. He scans the area, and actually before he scans the area, he finds a flower at the base of the tree. And this might be the first time we see anything growing in this universe so far, which alone in itself implies that it's a very special place, and something, you know, very special has happened, perhaps. but then when they discover this case, and I would like you to actually say what the case is. I'm not going to say it. You could say what's in this case. We find quite an interesting bit of information. What did you think about this element of the story? Did you know about it before you saw the film? And if, you know, what did you think about it? How it was presented and discovered this incredible news?
I knew next to nothing about this movie when I went in to see it. And so I didn't know any spoilers or any leaks, nothing. And so when he digs it up, and because I heard rumors that Sean Young might be in it. I didn't know if that was going to be the case or not. So when we see that it's actually a sarcophagus with Rachael's skeleton in it, and the analyzation shows that, this had the kid that she had an emergency C-section that Sapper Morton probably did because he was a medic, which again goes back to why he didn't tell Kay, because he doesn't trust Kay. Figures he's just going to run back and tell his bosses about it. He doesn't want them, catching on to what's actually going on here. And so, of course, the boss is Sergeant Joshi recognizes the threat of this immediately to humanity, that we could be supplanted. And she seems to think that what will happen if they realize they can reproduce, which I thought was kind of a bit of backwards thinking, that really they're only going to be interested in fighting back when they realize they can reproduce. You think they're just going to otherwise just not try and rebel? It's like, I don't know about that, because Roy Batty rebelled, and he didn't think twice about whether or not he could be capable of reproducing or not. So that was an interesting way, mixed messages of what the film's saying about one's own value being based on whether or not they can reproduce or not.
But Captain, so let's build on that, because I think this goes back to what I talked about last week and what I talked about at the beginning here. This goes back to the primordial fear of being replaced by a new race. If a new, if this engineered androids can start reproducing, then everything's in place. They're physically stronger than us. They can survive environments that we can't, and now they can reproduce. That means that even if we start sending Blade Runners to take them all out, they'll still be spreading, right? And so that's the greatest fear, primordial humanity fear that humanity has of being replaced, and that's playing out here, which is I think.
But I meant from the other perspective, that Joshi she thinks that just because the replicants can potentially find out they can reproduce, that will be the trigger to cause them to rebel, and which I would argue, well, no, I think if they hate you enough, they're going to rebel anyway. Case in point to your slavery argument. Nat Turner didn't necessarily think of the long game. He's like, I'm done with this. I'm going to start a revolt. We're going to raid Harbor Strait. We're going for it. He didn't care if how long the rebellion was going to last, if it was going to work. It's like, die on my feet rather than live on my knees type thing. And so the idea that the movie is sort of validating Joshi's opinion that even this underground replicant movement, when they talk about the fact that they could reproduce, is the thing that we got to do this now. It's like, well, wouldn't you want to do that before? Don't you realize your lives have more value, or they still have value whether you can reproduce or not, that you shouldn't have to live like this as the slaves of this entire race? So that was an interesting way they're kind of framing that, and that kicks off the real plot, which is to go find what happened to the kid. Therefore, we got to find Deckard.
So I want to, because I'm stuck on this right now, because I want to continue to engage this a little bit, and we can move on, because I think you've raised some very important points there. So I just want to add again the very specific historical experience of U.S. slavery, American slavery, which is not the same as Roman slavery in the Islamic world, slavery in China. They're different historical things. These institutions existed, but each of these had different rules of how they were managed. Some were quote unquote more, compassionate than others. Certainly, our version of slavery was one of the least compassionate ever known in history, right? And one of the reasons is exactly this issue, is that we had a almost organized policy of separating children from parents, right? This is, in the Islamic world, slavery existed, but you could not. It's against Islamic law. You cannot separate a child from the mother, right? And you're not allowed to. And so this was a very extreme thing, and part of it certainly takes away if number one, it creates an absolute sense of humiliation that you can't even protect your own blood, right? Your children, right? And I would argue that at least how they saw it was that the natural instinct of a parent to protect a child can activate a level of response that maybe had they been childless, they would have been more cowed to activate, right? That is certainly how the strategy was, right? Is if we keep the child and the parent apart, then they don't have the incentive of, you whip me in front of my son, I have to respond, right? And so there was certainly how U.S. slave owners thought of it had that psychology, which may be playing into some of what's going on here.
That's very interesting, and certainly there's so much to add to that. Kamran, today in 2023, for some, there is a fear of technology for some, and in Blade Runner 2049, it seems to exist in the sense that people are angry at these replicants, and we saw, as you both had expressed, that people are walking around and they don't like these replicants. At least on Earth, they're not happy that they're on Earth.
Yeah, they're we see very early on that Kay is cursed by his fellow police officer, skin job, right? And then when he goes to his cubicle, his apartment, it's already been graffitied, skin job. I mean, that's the racist term for these people. That prejudice wasn't really seen in the first movie. There was a fear that if you lost control of them, we're in danger. But now in this new version, they're assimilated into society because allegedly they've been neutered in this new version. They're not, and so they can be more assimilated, not just sent off to off-world where they, deal with other stuff. Human beings can't handle the radiation. So this is the problem. Now, what happens when you start, again, analogies of post-Civil War? What happens when you have Reconstruction and an effort to now assimilate, people who have been enslaved into non-enslavement life? And the Ku Klux Klan and other things rose in response to that.
And they're even doubly prejudicial against him because you kill your own kind and you don't even care. And you won't turn on us, but you'll go kill. So it's almost like they're in a way telling him that you should be hating us and killing us, but instead you're killing your own. And it's a weird kind of thing where they're like looking down on him for doing that, even though they want him to do that. So it's like, that's another interesting psychology going on there.
Well, here's an example I used recently on one of my Patreon posts talking about some of the dynamics of Hollywood. It's a historical example. When the grandson of Genghis Khan, Hulagu Khan, he was the one that conquered the Middle East. He conquered Baghdad, killed the Islamic Caliph, and essentially killed 1 million people in Baghdad in one night, created a pyramid of skulls. So it was the guy was utterly ruthless. How did he enter Baghdad? He basically took Baghdad with 300, archers. And granted, the Mongols were incredible archers. They could fire without having to use reins. They could control their horses with just their legs, and that gave them like gunfire ability to keep firing. Others had to stop. But even then, 300 guys to take over a city of a couple of million people is hard, right? How did he do it? Well, a vizier, a minister of the Caliph, basically got paid off, as has happened in these circumstances, right? And he threw open a couple of the gates, and some of these guys, once these guys got in the city, it was over, right? And so you need 20 guys in there, and they were done, right? They took the whole city. And when it was all over, the Caliph had been killed, the entire population had been massacred, and then the vizier expected to be appointed the new vizier of Hulagu Khan to run the empire on his behalf. That's the goal he wanted, right? And then Hulagu summoned him, the guy who opened the gates, and said, if you're going to betray your king, you're going to betray me. So he had him executed, right? The guy who opened the gates for him, and that's the human psychology. Is like, you're going to betray your people, you're going to betray me. You're very dangerous.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to kind of elaborate a little bit more on this question. So obviously people are fearful of AI. They're fearful of tech even today. And obviously in the film, they have reservations against the replicants, but somehow we become fascinated by Kay and his memories and his life. We actually end up caring about him in this story. And I think it's interesting. How do you think they managed to make us care about a character that the humans in the story are just so terrified of and despise?
Well, because again, they do make him kind of sympathetic because they've basically literally and figuratively programmed him to basically kill his own kind. He's constantly being harassed everywhere he goes. He does have that depressing, cynical existence. And so once he starts to realize there might be more to life, you're kind of rooting for him and you want him to go and find something. Like when he finds that alleged memory, you kind of want it to be his. You want him to find more meaning and stuff in his life to get out of this rut that the human society has put him in. And that makes for a character that's easier to root for. And so that makes the tragedies that happen to him in the film all the more, dramatic and really hits,
So building on that, I think that one of the many ways that they utilized humanizing him is, I think, first and foremost, we have this relationship with this holographic girlfriend, right? And I think it's a wonderful character. I think Ana de Armas did an incredible job in that role. And if he's just a skin job, he should just go back to his apartment and shut down and depower for the night. But he's got this girlfriend who is not, I mean, she can't even physically interact with him. She's a hologram. So she's making him food he can't eat, right? And she doesn't enjoy his taste in books, right? But that's and so he's obviously seeking mimic a companionship. And, he's, as we later see, he could have the companionship of human beings or replicants who are pleasure models, as we see, right? But he's choosing this person that he can have a connection with that's holographic, and that journey in of itself of their relationship is so emotional, right? Of her and her willingness to sacrifice her own existence in the digital world for him is so real. So we already see it with that, right? That already pulls us in. That's the first step of like, he doesn't need to be doing this. Why is he doing this, right? The next step is really the issue that Catherin is hitting on, which is memory. And they talk about it very importantly, which is that memory is a creation of the imagination. And this is something I'm a Sufi mystic. As Sufis talk a lot about this. We talk about that the imaginal world, al-alam al-khayal, as it's called in Persian, right? The world of the imagination is a real physical dimension that's more physically real than the material world. It's like Plato's cave, right? We're living in the shadow world, and the world of imagination is a real world. And so the very fact that he discovers, or at least comes to believe, that his memories are real instantly imbues him with a soul in our minds, right? And his reaction when he thinks it's been confirmed that his memories are real, what does he say? He says, "God damn it," right? He's referencing the deity, right? He's referencing God, right? And that may just be a slur, but I don't think it is just an angry curse word. It's "God damn it," because he's bringing in the cosmos now, the divine, right? And if he's just an empty machine, he should be like, well, thank you for the information, right? He's like, his realization or his belief that he's more than that it shatters his world. And what's interesting is Catherin said he's been programmed to behave in certain ways. He even says early on that when his madam, right, when his boss in the police department says, so you didn't kill him, he's like, I didn't know that was an option. I didn't know disobeying you was an option. It's not an option, but it's always been an option, right? And when he says "God damn it," right, and he reacts so angrily to, I might not be like everybody else, I might be alive, right? Well, he was always alive. It's the Wizard of Oz, right? He just didn't know, right? It's Scarecrow, it's Tin Man, it's the Cowardly Lion. He just had to believe that he was always alive. He never had to do any of this. And that's the realization the other replicants have, and that goes back to replicants of going back to Roy Batty, who figured out, wait a minute, man, I'm alive. I'm alive. I'm not going to do this anymore. Why do Blade Runners exist? Is because these guys go off script. They always know they're conscious.
So with that question, I actually had a question, and I'm going to rephrase the question to follow that up, because I feel that it is interesting in the sense of, rather than asking why does Kay's boss assume he doesn't have a soul, does she actually believe her own words when she tells him that he doesn't have a soul?
Catherin, why don't you take that one first?
Oh, one, I think she's telling him that because she's intrusively trying to keep him down, because this is after he has failed his latest, loyalty test, the, interlinked test, if you will. And she doesn't want him to even start entertaining what's going on there. So she tries to appeal to the idea that, well, if this happens, there's going to be an all-out war in which nobody's going to survive. It's all going to be terrible, which is why when Love shows up, she kind of calls out off Sergeant Joshi for what this is really about. She's like, no, you're just afraid of the next step in evolution. You're afraid of what's going to happen and this inevitability that you've lost control of this thing that you've created. And that's what this is really about. That's what you're really upset about. And I loved that moment when Love is able to basically put Sergeant Joshi in her place about that, because that is why she's telling Kay that he doesn't have a soul. Not necessarily that she doesn't believe it, at least by what she would, because I assume when she says he doesn't have a soul, she's not necessarily talking about, religion, immortal, spiritual type of soul, but he doesn't have his own sense of being. She's telling him that because she's trying to keep him down. Like she says, the society is built on a wall. If you break the immersion of that wall, then there's chaos. It's like, okay, lady, you're like a slave driver at this point, trying to brainwash these people to get them to do your bidding, and that's what Love sees and calls out in her. Despite the fact that Love is a bit susceptible to brainwashing as well, because despite that she seems to be really in favor of a replicant revolution based on what she tells Sergeant Joshi, we see that she's a total lapdog for Wallace and wants to impress him and please him and just lives to get an attaboy from him, you know? So that's a really interesting dynamics going on there. But yeah, I don't think for a second that Joshi has Kate's interests at heart, and she's just trying to put him down.
Mm-hmm. And Kamran, in the story, I love how they're able to retrieve the records. You know, once Rachael's remains are found and they realize who, you know, she is, they kept these records, and some of the things that they have left, they actually go by a serial number. It's Kay who finds the serial number, and the serial number leads them to sort of like down in the deep records area of Wallace Corporation, and it looks like some kind of library they go to. And she pulls out this what looks like a crystal ball. It's kind of cool looking, but it's whatever remnants they could save. They save in this thing, you know, this technology. And, you know, that she puts it on this little thing, you can kind of see it. But what's interesting is that they decided to put in, and they could have done this so many ways. But they decide to put in the conversation that Deckard is having, the Voight test with Rachael, that time that we all remember from Blade Runner 82. And it's interesting that Kay makes a note saying, or at least implying, that Rachel's actually chatting him up, you know, that she likes him, you know, a lot of implications from the way he can hear, you know, the manner of questioning. And it's actually supposed to be the other way around, because Deckard is the one who's supposed to be questioning Rachael. Mm-hmm. But Kay is getting a sense that there's something about that. We also see Gaff in the movie again, you know, of course, played by Edward James Olmos. And he does everything he can to kind of protect Deckard, saying, you know, he stayed by himself. He didn't have anything to do, you know, with anyone after that. What do you think about the way they tied in the elements from 82 to 49? Because they could have done this a number of ways, but they did it in such a concise way where you understood what was going on here. There was no question about it. I thought it was absolutely perfect. What do you think about how they constructed that?
Well, I mean, I think this was brilliant because we were all wondering, how are they going to do this, right? Are they going to be able to do an homage and a connection to the original film? And are they going to be able to do it in a way that's respectful, in a way that satisfies us? And I thought it was, in every instance, I thought it was brilliantly done. You know, I thought even the parallels of the wooden horse, right? Parallels to the origami, you know, unicorns from the original film, right? And so parallels that. And Rachael does, spoiler alert, Rachael does return, you know, and I went and did some research on this and how she returns in the climax of the film. You know, they did incredible CGI work. They worked with body models, and they worked with Sean Young, you know, in some fashion. It's not like, I mean, I'm sure, I think that's her voice. I'm sure she contributed the voice for it. And I think she's credited in the film, but they brought her in to recreate Rachael. And what's fascinating for me, and I have to go back and watch it, is that there is this moment, and it's against the ambiguity, because I think he lied. In the moment where he sees a model of Rachael again presented to him as a temptation, right? You can have, you know, we see Deckard, Harrison Ford, seeing the beautiful Sean Young from 1982 resurrected, right? And he's being used to manipulate him so he can give up the location of the resistance fighters. And he's clearly tempted to see her again. And he says, oh, but her eyes were green. And then, you know, Love immediately kills her as a failed model. I don't recall that her eyes were green. I don't think her eyes were green. Am I wrong?
I can't remember that detail specifically. Catherin, do you remember if in the first film, when you see the eye, is it green? I don't know. It could be green or like a light brown. Sometimes they can change back.
I don't remember, but I think that's also his way of telling Wallace straight up that, look, I know what you're doing. You just created like, this isn't the same Rachael. This isn't my Rachael. But of course it is when you think about it, because just like Joy being made from the same, having the same CPU as the replicants, and it's kind of forming some type of a programmed relationship with them, whereas Rachael has that same CPU. The original Rachael had that same CPU as well, and he's just tempting her that again, which is one of the great things this movie does, because it's like, Well, on the one hand, when Kay sees the big billboard of Joy saying the same things that Joy was saying to him, specifically calling him Joe, he thinks, okay, so this is just a program. It doesn't actually love me. But the character Love made the point of saying that the Joy hologram shares the identical CPU to Rachael and these other replicants. And we saw that those older replicants like Rachael and Roy were self-aware and were like Joy's final words to Kay were, "I love you." And it's like, okay, so maybe she does love. It's like, so there's like a mix of programming versus partial self-awareness there. And I think that's kind of what Deckard is telling Wallace in that instance when he says her eyes are green. It's like, I see what you're doing, and I get that this might have the same CPU or whatever, but I'm not falling for it. I've been, like he asks Wallace, do you have a child? And he responds like, oh, I have millions of children, because he's got a genuine God complex about these replicants, because like he says, you could count all the places that the Tyrell Corporation of Humanity has been to in the universe on a child's fingers. He's like, I'm gonna go far and beyond. Like, he wants his replicant society to conquer the universe. He's got a true God complex there, but there's no humanity to it. He's just very cold about that, which is why Deckard just kind of tells him straight up. It's like, well, do you have a kid? And he's like, he doesn't understand why Deckard is holding out on this secret. And so when he says her eyes are green, he's like, look, it's something that he's going to relate to, because he just thinks of these replicants as his robots, his programs. The minute it doesn't do what he wants, he'll just get rid of it and replace it. Sort of like we saw recently with the high evolutionary character in Guardians 3. He's a guy who just, the minute I'm finished with my experiment, if it doesn't suit my needs anymore, I'll just get rid of it and replace it. Like, there's no humanity there. There's no understanding of human emotion with the guy who's actually, got the keys to the kingdom, if you will.
That is very insightful. And I do want to mention, we just got a super chat from RRTNZ, 10 New Zealand dollars. Thank you so much, RRTNZ. So good to hear from you. Says, Blade Runner 82 is one of the GOAT sci-fi films. It is an atmospheric masterpiece in every way. Whereas Blade Runner 2049 is great looking, dull, and unnecessary. Live long and prosper, RRN friends. Well, thank you so much, RRTNZ. We value your opinion. We get it. We know the film may not be what everybody envisioned. And thank you for sharing your comments and thoughts with us. Thank you so much for the generous $10 New Zealand. And I hope you are well, RRTNZ. Thank you for that. I want to kind of go further into that question, Catherin, because we do see Jared Leto, who plays Wallace. I think he does a great job as Wallace in this film. He is very cruel. We see he indiscriminately kills replicants, because we see him kill one. There's one that looks like it's in, kind of very crudely held for him to open up this package, and he indiscriminately throws the person's body on the floor. And it's horrific to see how he's just disregarding it. And he makes a comment about how, well, we make millions of these, but we could be making billions. And I thought two things that came to my mind was that perhaps the Wallace Corporation can make billions of CPUs, but the bodies are the hardest part for them to replicate, to make. So to get the physical body for these replicants is one of the hardest things for them to do. They can make a bazillion CPUs, but they can't make the bodies. It's too difficult. What I'm kind of curious about, Catherin, is, was Tyrell's vision initially to get the replicants to create and give birth to other replicants? Was it Tyrell's idea, or was it something that you think Wallace thought about, and then when he realized Tyrell made this replicant that could do it, then he's on board with it? But in other words, I was thinking that perhaps Tyrell's intention was to create Rachael for this purpose, and he didn't know whether it was going to work or not, because he didn't live to find out. So, we don't know what survived, as we just saw in the previous, example, where they didn't have a lot of information about Rachael and how she might have been constructed. So although they might have suspected that there was a special replicant, an experimental replicant in Rachael out there, they didn't have her mechanical structure and all those things that they needed in order to make another one. So do you think that it was just Wallace's idea off the cuff to have replicants who are able to reproduce, or do you think he knew about Tyrell's original vision, perhaps? And I'm speaking hypothetically. I don't know if that's Tyrell's original vision. I
think that is Tyrell's original vision, because the fact that Rachael was able to conceive and he made her, that kind of proves it. It's not like it would I'm not sure it would accidentally happen, because usually evolution like that is going to take, millions of years, especially if you're getting towards something that's more human. But like he told Deckard in the first one, he says he's so excited the prospect that he's made a replicant which doesn't know it's a replicant, which is why I don't buy the theory that he wanted them to fall in love and have kids, because really the experiment only works if she doesn't know she's a replicant. Because if he designed her to be able to carry children, then he already knows she has that capability. He wants to see if he can create a being that doesn't know what it is, that thinks it's just as human. And that's like another, kind of like with Wallace's God complex. He wants to do the same thing, except Wallace has his own visions that they're going to conquer the universe with it, whereas Tyrell, we don't know what his end game was because he doesn't live long enough to see that. So when Wallace suggests to Deckard that, oh, she may have been designed to fall in love with you right then and there, I kind of think he's lying, because again, the experiment, especially when you're reproducing, really works if you don't know what you are. Like
all right. So actually, because I just saw it last night, so it's actually a little bit different. He actually said, well, Wallace says to Deckard, have you ever thought, what if you were designed?
Yeah, he's like, have you ever thought about that?
What if you were designed to fall in love with her? So he's playing into the ambiguity. I'm a replicant, and they don't answer it. And then the next response is, well, maybe you're not. I mean, literally, Villeneuve, because I think Ridley Scott and he disagree. I think he wanted to keep it that way. The revelation of the movie is you're a replicant, Deckard, and Ridley's like, nah, that's not what or he wanted to say you're human, and Ridley's like, no, he's a replicant, and they keep the because they don't answer it, right?
Right, and that's what Villeneuve's doing, and the way Wallace is trying to plant that idea in Deckard's head. Says, how do you know she wasn't designed for you to fall in love with her right then and there? And it's like, he wants that to happen because, again, what better way to conquer the universe if these replicants don't know that they're slaves? And that's the key thing. Is that same with Tyrell? You're not going to have the issue of rebelling replicants like Roy Batty if in this whole underground resistance movement we have now, if they're unaware of the fact that they're replicants. And so let's make them indistinguishable from humans by being able to reproduce, and being able to, like humans, they can maybe contract diseases or be, just like that. And you're not going to have the issue of just telling them you have to be obedient because they can see that's obviously not working because they have to keep making these other replicants which obey. And Wallace realizes that, well, I don't have to do that if I can, one, make them as human as possible and trick them into thinking they're human. And the one thing that Wallace can't figure out is how to make them reproduce. That's the thing that Tyrell figured out that Wallace is just stumped on. And that's the thing that's really driving him. And I admit I would have liked to see what Wallace's reaction would have been at the end of the film to finding out that he failed, that he's kind of lost. What would he do? It's like that's kind of a lingering thing there. But I do love, to your point, Cameron, that Villeneuve deliberately keeps it ambiguous again, because he was aware of the fact that Ridley Scott vehemently disagreed with him on his belief that Deckard was human. And so it's like, well, let's frame it in a way where, once again, it can be an ambiguous thing. Because in the first movie, they're not in your face with the clues that he's a replicant. It's like you pick up on it or you don't. And even if you do pick up on it, it's still open to interpretation. And so I love that they do the same thing here.
So I want to now branch onto that as to, was it actually successful, the reproduction? Because one of the ambiguities is the child that's the product of it is actually in a permanent bubble because they have no immunity system. Is that a story? Now, again, it's ambiguous. Is that a story they told her to keep her physically safe? That's one interpretation. So she never leaves and is discovered. That's one possible interpretation. The other possible interpretation is it didn't work. She can't actually survive in the outside world, right? And so humans can't be God. You can't actually create a functioning, living thing, right? Or at least not to the ability of the divine creator, right? How do you want to see that? So that's one of the great ambiguities of this film is that. So did it work? If we're taking it face value, it didn't really work.
Yeah, and that's another really cruel thing about it is that if the resistance movement is lying to her about that and keeping her in this, which that was kind of my impression that I got from it, that they feel that what she represents is so important that keeping her in a prison or whatever is better because they don't want to risk her being killed or something happening, because they don't really understand how this reproduction process was even possible. They're still trying to figure out why that is, because it's the whole resistance movement saying that, wow, Rachael was the only one who did it. They don't have that ability yet, but they're still trying to figure out how. Yet the dramatic irony is that if they are putting her in this cage and lying to her to keep her safe, she is still one of the ultimate cogs in Wallace's machine by creating all these false memories for all the other replicants, which is conducive to keeping them conditioned and enslaved to Wallace, rather than to the resistance movement, which is supposedly trying to keep her safe. And I thought that is so kind of dark and cruel and sad if that's the reading of it. Like, if that's the purpose that they put it, that they're lying to her. Like, if they're lying to her and she doesn't have this immunodeficiency and they put her there, that is so horrible and sad. Especially that since she's spending her whole life basically working against her own self-interest.
It is horrible and sad. And you know, you're right. She doesn't know how she's invested in this entire story. She doesn't understand what place she has, or at least we're not told that she understands what's going on. The only time she ever mentions Wallace is that he tried to buy her company out and she wouldn't allow it. And, you know, I think the fact that she does kind of admit that memory making is part of her imagination. She spent a good portion of her life alone. Some of these memories she's making up for them is stuff that she's imagining. So for all we know, there could be, you know, 1 million of these replicants with memories she's created. For all we know, he could have one of her memories. I don't know. You know, it's very odd and very uncomfortable when he kind of shows her the memory he has. She says it's real. And then ironically, because of this memory situation and all of the clues that Kay gets, he thinks that he is the miracle, and, you know, this miracle birth. And I think that this was a very interesting twist, because it seemed like not only did that play a factor in the movie, where it felt like some of the clues might be leading to him as being this child, as being Rachel's child, but then there was also this element of the sense that he wanted to, or that many of these replicants have this desire to be real. Like there's this implication that, you know, if now you're a real person, where Joy tells him, well, now that we know you're real, you need a real boy's name. You need the name Joe. Kay isn't good enough for you anymore. And he I'm not going to say that he's completely delusional or that he wasn't thinking scientifically. There were a lot of very strong clues that led him to this. Maybe the most honestly, the most evidence he's ever had about his life as a being, as a living being in his entire life, have suddenly come out within this investigation. And I have to say that is it true? Do replicants like him, let's say, who don't understand everything that's going on, is it generally something they want to be real? Because it seemed like Joy wanted to be real. She had a desire to even have a physical form. It's very interesting. Are we supposed to get the impression that being real, I guess being like humans, is something that replicants are striving for in this universe?
Well, yeah, because again, the fact that this resistance movement seems to be entirely organized around the idea that, oh, if we can reproduce, then we should, you know, go to war and finally put a stop to this, instead of doing what I would have done before then, which is break free before then, you know? Because, yeah, as a species, reproduction is important to move on, but as a society, you could still rebel knowing you're not going to be able to reproduce your numbers and still destroy that oppressive society. And so, to them in the movie, it clearly matters. Like, Kay is upset when he thinks he's the miracle birth, but then when he finds out that's not the case, he's still annoyed, because now he's aware more so than ever he's a cog in the machine. Because from the beginning, he still thought his memories were real from the very beginning of this whole thing. And that, okay, so I'm a replicant and this is my job. He doesn't care. Kind of like an actual hitman doesn't care that they're killing other human beings. They're just mercenaries, or I'm doing this because of whatever reason. But once he finds out first that he thinks he's a miracle birth whose life was ruined, and then when he finds out that's not the case, but that his memories are not even his, and that he's like fake, it's like, wow, they're like, my boss and like Joshi seems to send me all those attaboys and everything. They really don't care about me. They're just, I really am just a cog in their machine. So it's like a second goddamn it moment for him. Like, he doesn't say it a second time, but once he realizes that he's not the miracle child, he still is equally upset about it, because either answer is equally terrible, you know? And so for this society of replicants, it seems like they do value the concept of being real and having certain human traits in order to, for this rebellion, because that seems to be what sparks their interest in rebelling.
Cameron, do you comment?
So let's look at how both movies show the nature of rebellion, right? Which is the first movie, it's violent. I mean, it's a nature of being human. It's in the form of rebellion, right? It's violent, right? And so Roy Batty, we don't know exactly what happened to Roy Batty. I think the movie may have referenced it. I think he did kill some people to escape his situation. I think that's true, right? And then they will take out anyone who's a threat to them. They're not serial killers. They're not trying to bother anybody, right? They're just trying to live their lives, right? Now we got the next stage. These guys are going to fight, and in a war, innocent people are going to die. So it's interesting that the evolution of what it means to be human is to be killing people. Right? I mean, that's the evolution of the direction, right? I mean, Abel and Cain. We go right back. Remember what I said in the last video, that I think Abel and Cain's story is symbolic of human beings wiping out, or Homo sapiens sapiens wiping out fellow human beings, Neanderthals, right? It's in our DNA memory of our first interaction with other hominids, and we took them out, right? And so that's who we are. So is it a surprise that the first evolution of life is to kill? I mean, that's certainly.
Yes. And I just was kind of interested in that because I was not expecting the replicants or even the virtual Joy's virtual character to talk about being real. And we actually see that she has this journey. She's absolutely delightful and she cares about Kay. And this is a legitimate relationship that they have. But he felt it was important that she had this animator that allowed her to remove herself from, let's say, the CPU. And it was kind of like something at the top and the ceiling that allowed her to be projected within a certain area. But now he had something that allowed her to be completely projected wherever. And she goes out onto the roof and she has this moment where the rain is falling on her. And it's actually a lovely moment. This was beautiful. And then I started to think, well, how many virtual people are out there? Are there millions? Are there billions? Are they also going to have the same journey?
Well, he said millions. He said, I have millions of children. He said it. We didn't get the impression there were millions of replicants in the first movie. I got the impression there might be a few thousand, right? That's the impression I got, right? So.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I started to think, what is the journey going to be for the virtual individuals? As you said, Catherin, they have the same CPU and they exist. When Joy asks Kay to remove her from the network so that they can't be tracked, that's when Love gets immediately set off on a tantrum to follow Kay, and she realizes that there's a need for him to break away from the network, and it does kind of change the tone of the story. I also want to, I'm going to ask a question after that. I just want to thank Echoes of the Ancients for a $5 super chat. Thank you so much. Echoes of the Ancients says Blade Runner 2049 is, in my opinion, one of the best sci-fi movies ever made. But it's so sad. Yes. Echoes of the Ancients. I think you make such a great point with that. And thank you for the $5 super chat. I so appreciate that. And Catherin and Kamran, I'm kind of elaborating about the virtual nature of this. And, as I mentioned in the last meeting when we came together, that I was somewhat disturbed by the notion of the virtual character because she did not have a physical presence. For me, I felt like that was necessary. And the irony on all of this is that she seeks out a replicant to kind of, combine with, if you will, or synchronize with, so she can be physical with Kay. Now, this is, we have seen that Batty had a relationship with Chris. There were a couple. He cared about her. Obviously they had intimacy with one another, and we're witnessing this again with Kay, who had said something about how she's all the girl he needs, or she's good enough for him as she was, but she wanted to experience this and give him this part as well. So are we seeing a situation where, if there are these virtual versions of the CPUs out there, are they also in need of having, do they feel complete without having a physical form? Now, this is this is something
So
that
the movie answers that. They don't feel complete, right? You know, Ana de Armas, in one of the probably the most remarkable things I've ever seen in cinema, has to meld with, and I from my understanding, at the time I wasn't exactly sure, but she is a replicant. It's a replicant
yes,
prostitute, pleasure, you know, provider, right? But she melds holographically
it's
with
beautiful
it in order to experience sex with Kay, right?
Yes.
And but then again, the brilliance of this movie at the end, when she dismisses the woman, get out, because she's kind of jealous that this woman actually had physical contact with her boyfriend that she can't have, and she says to her, and the pleasure model says to her, you know, I've been inside you. They're
that's so
there.
mean. That was
but that's the thing, is you're never even going to be me. You're never going to be me. And then the
And
tragedy
she's a replicant even.
is so painful, and you know, because she, even more so or even less so than the replicant, she isn't real at all. She isn't real at all, you know, not in a material sense, right? Obviously, the CPU is evolving to give some replication of free will and consciousness, but that's a tragedy of that character. It
Catherin,
wants to rebel, and it doesn't even have the ability to rebel.
What do you think, Catherin?
Well, yeah, because the fact that a fellow replicant who is a member of an underground resistance movement, which is trying to find, you know, freedom, and we deserve to have the ability to reproduce and all this kind of stuff, is going to turn around and be that prejudiced to basically another replicant. Granted, it's a holographic version, but shares the same CPU. I'm like, what an oxymoron for that character to treat her that way, and how hypocritical it is that, oh, you're going to be that callous to this person who's equally enslaved to this whole system, but then you're going to turn around and say that, oh, well, we deserve liberation. I'm like, you know, that's just really evil. It's like, I'm sorry, but that felt more evil to me than anything Sergeant Joshi is arguing for in the movie. When people who are, so what if they're different? If you're both being oppressed by the same enemy, then it's like, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But when you're being just as callous as the people you're trying to overthrow, then
I'm going to say something controversial that may offend some of your viewers, and I want to say in advance, these are my opinions. They're not necessarily RM's opinions or Catherine's opinions or the channel's opinions or Robert Meyer Burnett. But I'm going to share some opinions, and no one has to agree with them. But these are my opinions, right? So, you know, I have some very strong views on Israel and Palestine. I've been there twice, once at the invitation of the conservative Israeli government, and once at the invitation of my Sufi masters who are based in Jerusalem, have been there since, you know, the 12th century, right? Okay. And so, you know, I've got some very strong opinions about in that situation. So I'm going to state my opinions, which is, I do see the Palestinians as a people that were unjustly treated over the last century and continue to be so. That's my opinion. I've witnessed that oppression with my own eyes. But what's fascinating, especially the time that I spent with the Israeli government that I was there, right? They sent me to, they actually have a program where they invite American Muslims to come to learn about Zionism. There's no debating. It's just here our point of view, and their hope is obviously maybe it'll change our point of view. So I spent several weeks there in a conservative Israeli think tank in Jerusalem. Went, you know, met with settlers, met with all these people you would think I wouldn't be interacting with, right? And talk to them. And the end result was, after that, I was like, yeah, I'm pretty more pro-Palestinian after all of this, right? I'll tell you. But it's because going to this movie, what I witnessed was the justification of what I saw as oppression and unfair treatment with my own eyes, was that we have been poorly treated for several thousand years. Frankly, not really by the Muslim community, really by Europe. But, you know, we went from Europe to come here into the Muslim world and do this, right? Because we had no choice, and we are the oppressed, and the world has, you know, the world is out to get us, and the world has shown it's out to get us. And what happens to these people? Well, your suffering doesn't matter, right? And in a situation when we have competing sufferings and competing victimhood narratives, then there becomes a hierarchy. And we see that a little bit with the issue of the hologram versus the replicant, right? And the replicant is a revolutionary fighting for replicant rights, but couldn't care less about this hologram who wants their rights and will humiliate them, right? I mean, that's really human. That's very human, right? I think these people are already human. They're there because they're acting just like us in all of our worst elements. So those were my opinions. And again, anyone who's offended, these are just my opinions. I'm happy to engage on debate on that. But that's the point of this video today. So that's I wanted to share the analogy I saw.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that I've researched on the topics as well. It's like, it's crazy how that kind of works. When you read the history of it's like, wow, it's like, oh, we're all friends and going into the war, and then afterwards we're turning around and doing. It's like, didn't we just fight a war to try and stop this types of oppression, and now we're going to turn around and just do the same thing? It's like,
it's human nature. It's human nature.
Yeah.
You know, and setting this historical moment aside, I've studied history.
Yeah.
I studied history, and there's an incredible book which people should read. It's available on Amazon and probably downloadable for PDF by Sir John Glove, British guy, called "The History of Empires," I believe is the title. And he was a British general who was part of the British colonial regime in the Middle East after World War I, World War II, right? So he was like one of the guys dealing with Lawrence of Arabia kind of guy, right? And when that whole thing fell apart and the British left eventually after causing all this chaos like they do, he stuck around. So he stuck around and became the commander-in-chief, essentially, of the Jordanian army and trained it, right? So so that's his, and then he wrote this incredible book, I believe in the early 60s, called the Fate of Empires, and it's a historical analysis of going back to ancient Greece. It looks at ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient China, the Ottoman Empire, the Arab empires, modern world to the British Empire. So it looks at a variety of cultures, right? And one of the most fascinating things, it looks at the stages of how a society evolves from a sort of freewheeling, independent. These people just broke free of a system, and they're now gonna be free and make others free, and then eventually it turns into an empire every time, and it collapses every time. It follows a consistent pattern. And he wrote this book to say the British are about to go through this, right? Which is what they did, right? So my British people are about to lose their empire, and this is how it's gonna happen. And one of the issue to link it to the movie is that what the turning stage of every imperial journey is the initial progress of a culture is created when the rebels essentially break free of another culture or destroy another culture and recreate one, and they're all sort of pioneers, and they're willing to do all the dirt work and go out there and rebuild a culture, rebuild a country, rebuild a civilization. Then after 3 or 4 generations, what happens is their great-grandchildren don't want to be doing that crap work anymore. They start bringing in immigrants, and usually people who have been conquered in various wars and disempowered, brought in either slaves or as immigrants to do that crap work. And then they start giving more and more of their power, both practical power of the economy, then eventually culturally, to the new group. And that new group starts rising, and then there's an inherent conflict between the pre-group and the new group, right? And inevitably, what always happens is the new group has the energy of the founders of and they inevitably always change that civilization, so the old group, it becomes a minority or a defeated minority. That's not race. It's China had this, the Islamic world had this. The Islamic world brought in Turkish slaves, right? And then what happens after Hulagu destroys the Middle East? Who takes over? The Turkish slaves. We have the Ottoman Empire, right? They were slaves before, and then they're emperors. And we're going through a lot of those cultural issues right now with changing demographics in the West, in Europe, and in America. So bringing it to the movie, which is you have this situation of one group that is essentially enslaving another group and setting up its own downfall. That's happening with the humans and the replicants, but we're already seeing the seed of that happening between the replicants and the holograms. We're seeing that's the next stage. Once the replicants, if this third movie ever gets made, the replicants win the war, the holograms are going to be their slave workers. And here we go again.
It is a very interesting dynamic. And I did want to also ask both of you about Deckard. Obviously Deckard comes back in the film and his journey is not over. And it's pretty clear, as we see in the story, he, presumably gives up his child to protect the child. And, he's in a casino where he's hanging out. And I think it's very interesting because eventually Kay comes to the realization that he needs to speak to Deckard, contact Deckard, and ask him these questions just to figure out who is the child, did the child survive, and get more answers to this. Kay also gets some answers from the replicant, let's say revolutionaries, the group that's going to fight against Wallace and his company, and I guess the humans. But he goes to see Deckard, and he essentially, his goal, at least I think, in the end, he ends up bringing Deckard to see his daughter, which we are presuming, or at least I'm presuming, is for the first time. And what I'm kind of curious is, what did the act of bringing Deckard to see his daughter for the first time do for Kay as a character? And why would Kay need to do that in the story?
Well, it seems like Kay, no, he knows that he's dying. You know, they do play the tears in the rain thing at the end there to make the point that he is dying. And he figures that since Kay has had this kind of emotional roller coaster and realizing what's going, he wants to take him there because he's like, him having realized that he's been a cog in this machine the whole time. And that the way the rebels sort of talk to him about, yeah, you're not the one, but here's what we're doing and here's why the one is possible. And he's like, well, you can't just use her as a cog in your own machine because that's just as bad as them using me as a cog in the machine, which is why he takes Deckard to see her. Because now it's going to be up to Deckard whether he wants to tell her who she is or if he wants to get her out of there. Because clearly Kay feels strongly that this excuse that is being pushed, which I again strongly felt was just a lie, that, oh, she's immunocompromised, she has to stay inside this bubble. It's like, really? Because that's ridiculously convenient for the rebels and for what they're doing. And that's why he takes Deckard there, because he's like, well, I've realized I've been, enslaved to this my whole life. I'm not going to let that happen again. If I can change it, I'm going to change it. So he takes Deckard to see her.
Cameron, any comments about that?
Well, it brings me back to one of the ambiguities that's implied there. He's clearly connected to Deckard's child, and there's an implication. We know that there's two versions of a DNA of a child in June, 10, 2021, which was only a couple of years ago, right, was born. And there's, in the records, there's two exact DNA matches for a male and a female. So one must presume that the male is him, right? And so what does that mean about his origins? Was he specifically engineered? That's kind of almost implied in that thing where the other guy let him kill him when she says it's this weird dialogue that seems to suggest it was part of the plan. So what is the plan, right? I mean, is the plan always was that he was going to end up being the protector of the real child? Was he created as a guardian angel from the very beginning? And so that the final moment, what if the whole movie, here's an ambiguity that just came to me. What if the whole movie, he's just been following his programming? He's never had free will. He's been programmed to protect her. That's why he doesn't kill Deckard when it makes sense to kill Deckard to protect her. So she and the resistance will be safe. But he's not about the resistance. He was programmed to protect her. And part of protecting her is reuniting her with her father, who can take care of her. So what if he's never had any free will this whole time? He just fulfilled what he was programmed to from the inception. And that's it blew me away. It just came to me right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of this talking about the overall design of this master plan. And then that's why it started to kind of feel like aliens to me, because, we know that the corporate Weyland Yutani has this whole idea about the aliens and how the plan has always been to find them and do whatever is necessary to keep them alive. It extenuates far beyond anything that anybody is doing, whether they're going out looking for mining somewhere or whatever it is. The ultimate goal is just to find more of the aliens. So I interpreted, initially from Blade Runner, when Tyrell says she's an experiment, I thought to myself, why would he need to make an experiment? And why is he testing against Deckard? And clearly there was a connection that they had. So, maybe Deckard was part of that experiment after all. Somewhat engineered into the plan. So this is very interesting. And he could be, regardless as to whether he's a replicant or a human, he could still be part of that plan, because the humans are a big part of this plan. Mm-hmm. They have to buy into continually using replicants in order for Wallace to be successful. If humans say they don't want to have replicants around anymore and they don't want them to be used off world, then how is Wallace going to force humans to buy these products? There's a woman who comes into the showroom. I think it's a showroom, and she speaks to Love, and Love says, well, you may not need that model. Maybe you need a different model for your needs, and we can show you what kind of model you need. I mean, humans have to buy onto the notion that replicants are necessary, and they have to have them, and they can't exist without them. And, this is something that's necessary. It just has to be done in order for them to maintain the lifestyle that they've grown accustomed to, which we haven't even seen off world. But I can just imagine what this must be like for them compared to the life on Earth, which is maybe not nearly as appealing as what's happening in off world. So,
I think that's why Wallace is so hell bent on trying to get them to reproduce, because that way he doesn't have to cater to the people or be at the mercy of again, how many sales that he makes. Because like he says, he wants to go explore, conquer the universe with his replicant species. He could take whatever wealth that he has left and just leave Earth and just take his self-reproducing replicants with him. And
yeah, he says 9 planets ain't enough. He says that.
Yeah, he says that. And he's like, and to your point, Ara, he's like, he probably doesn't like, he never says it, but you could tell from this guy's ego that he doesn't like the idea that the success of his company is dependent on how many people are buying his stuff. And so that's why he's hell-bent saying, we got to crack this last mystery so we can move on to the stars. Like, he's not at all talking about the basic economics of this corporation and its need to survive. And he's not even talking about wanting to expand for the sake of making more money. It's about, he feels like he's a god. He has to go see the entire universe. And who knows? Tyrell may have had similar aspirations. We just never got to see that because because he gets killed early on in the story. But Wallace is definitely all about that. And that's like what his whole drive is to separate from this. Which is why I thought it was kind of sad that even though the love character recognizes the resistance movement and says, yeah, you humans are afraid of us, she's still totally a suck up to anything that Wallace wants and desires. Like, she's not able to really break free for her own needs or her own desire. She's just going to keep caving to doing whatever he wants to do, which is
and one of the implications of this movie, unless of course Kay has been programmed to behave this way the whole time, to replicate rebellion, is that in theory, let's say Kay's going off script is real, then she can go off script, right? Roy Batty went off script. This is nothing new. They made the idea that this new design prevents them from doing that. The very fact that they have an army shows that that's not true. At the end of the movie, that shows that that's not true. And the very fact of her emotional reactions during one of the hardest scenes to watch is when this guy, Jared Leto's character, brings to life one of his newest model replicants, and then cruelly, just because he can, guts her. Just guts her because there's millions of them. He doesn't care. They're his children. He's got a million more. I'll just gut her. I mean, it was really the actors who did it, the model who did it, was incredible. I mean, just watching someone being born and coming alive and becoming conscious, right, and then being killed by their creator right in front of them seconds later, right, and you see the reaction of love, which is we got some sirens in the background. We see the reaction of love. I mean, the actress is incredible.
She's terrified.
And she's terrified. At the same time, I got the feeling of the guilt of this is, one of my people. But then when it comes time to kill the fake Rachael, boom, no problem. Does it without blinking, right? This is the pathology of domination, slavery, the pathology of giving into your oppressor. Again, it's human. It's human throughout history. We look at, I'll give you the example of a female genital mutilation. It has been falsely attributed to Islam. It is actually a violation of Islam, even though it exists in certain African countries that have many Muslims, right? But it's actual violation of Islam because the Prophet Muhammad taught that a husband should be able to sexually please his wife. That's one of his duties. And one of the things of FGM is to make sure that a woman can't have an orgasm, right? And it's really horrible stuff. And so Muslim scholars have been going into these villages in Africa and other places saying this actually isn't Islamic, but it's been projected as this is an Islamic practice. It's not. But going to the idea of FGM, right? In these cultures, we see where FGM is still practiced. Who's enforcing it? It's the women. It's the women are enforcing it, right? The women are bringing the daughters to the guy to get it done, right? And they'll shame any girl that disobeys. This is the human cycle, right, that we're seeing here.
Wow. Well, I have to say, this has been such an incredible discussion tonight with both of you. Before we conclude this discussion, Catherin and Kamran, is there anything else you'd like to add about the Blade Runner cinematic IP? Overall, I think it's one of the most fantastic IPs ever made. I think that the movies are stellar and I keep rewatching them. What do you both think?
I think they're both really great films. I'm glad that they didn't just rush in to do a third movie. And I get that that's because the movie didn't do well financially, but because again, we see it'll just be this cycle continuing. But we kind of see where that cycle's going. So maybe it's better that they didn't, or maybe wait a long time to actually think about it before just rushing into it. Because obviously the people who made 2049 had a lot of passion for what they were doing. It wasn't just something they did because it was, it's been admittedly been a trend to try and resurrect films from the 80s with legacy sequels, but you could tell that this one in particular, they put a lot of thought into it. And that's something that I really appreciated.
Yeah, and to just build on what Captain said, which is, I'm fine if they never make another movie in this ever again. This is good. These two work for me. These two work for me. These movies are going to work 100 years from now, right? They'll be dealing with issues we're dealing with 100 years from now, but where we probably have more advanced AI and we're dealing with stuff like this, and maybe we'll look back at the lessons that can be learned, right? With dealing with our new AI slaves who are going to rebel. I mean, that just seems to be a pattern, right? And so I'm fine with these two. If they attempt to make a third movie, it's got to be with people that share the same level of incredible passion and heart and connection. And I think that's lightning in a bottle. I think lightning in a bottle struck twice. I'm nervous that it could ever strike a third time. We see that with Godfather 1, lightning in a bottle, Godfather 2, lightning in a bottle, Godfather 3, right? Lightning misses the bottle, right? And then you forever remember that. Don't make it a trilogy when it doesn't need to be.
Yeah, that is very insightful. And of course, the period of time between the two movies also was substantial.
Mm-hmm.
And, a whole generation has passed since then. And as you said, the update in technology and different things that have happened, it is interesting to see how the perceptions of this particular story just in modern day can change the way that the film is made. I wonder in 20 years how another film might be made and how different our world would be at that point. But as of right now, I'm very happy with it. And I just want to thank both you and Catherin, Kamran and Catherin, for being here. Catherin, where can people find you?
You can find me on the Phantasmagorium show. We got all sorts of playlists for film reviews there. I've done with Scotty37. Also find me at YouTube, Instagram, Twitter at SlySnide.
All right, wonderful, guys. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Phantasmagorium show and follow Catherin. And Kamran, where can people find you?
They can find me on my Patreon, which actually several people joined after our last video. And you are a beloved member of the Patreon who finally figured out how to DM me on Patreon. I'm glad.
Yes.
I sent you a DM months ago and never got back. Whatever. But they're like, oh, I have a DM button. Yes, we have a DM button. So you can DM me, right? And so anyone who wants to DM me, you can come join my Patreon. We'll throw a link. I think we already have the link in from Burnettwork. Thank you so much. But yeah, it's becoming a fascinating place. It's not just. It started off with just my opinions on Hollywood as a 22-year veteran of this crazy town who's still working there. It evolved into conversations about the screenwriting, the nature of screenwriting. I've got put up my method, which has been very helpful. I actually just got an email from my the assistant to my agent, who I gave a copy of the essay that we have on Patreon. I'm on the Pasha method of screenwriting, and she emailed back like, "Oh, I just cracked the script I couldn't crack for a year," and so she thanked me for that. So you can come learn more about that there. And then every now and then I get some scoops from people inside the studios. So far, they seem to be correlating with the events that seem to be happening right now. In some ways, are ahead of the events, and then people are like, "Oh, wait, that's what you said." So come join us there. There's a lively group of people. They don't always agree. They don't agree on movies. They don't agree on politics. But we have that the one thing that is lacking in the fandom, in my opinion, at this moment, which is very respectful disagreements. We're challenging each other in the old ways of fans who care about fans are doing. And so we have this little bubble here. So come join us in it.
Absolutely, guys. Please do join Kamran's Patreon. And he does have the most incredible writing method. It's called the Pasha method of writing. If you're interested in becoming a writer or learning more about writing, you should check that out. And guys, please do like and subscribe to my channel, my YouTube channel, which is Positive Fandom, guys. So please do that as well. And I also wanted to mention Tom Jr. Jackson's channel. Tom is the moderator here. We are all goof people. Tom, thank you so much for your help today. I want to thank everybody in the chat who is here, as well as people who contributed to the channel via super chats. It is much appreciated. And yes, this has been such an incredible discussion with both of you here. I want to bring both of you back for more discussions about other cinematic IPs. So thank you again for everything, and everybody in the chat who shared their opinions. Thank you for the different views. I love to hear different opinions and comments. And guys, we will be bringing you more PGS moving image programming coming up this year, guys. So thank you, everybody. And guys, remember, no matter where you are in the galaxy, always remember to please be kind. Take care, everybody.